Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and welcome to Mercy Unbound. It's a show that aims to provide hope, an avenue for healing, and one that will help you understand and then live the great mercy of God. With me today, I have a special guest, Dr. Stacy Trasancos from Texas. She's going to be discussing her book, IVF is Not the Way, The False Promises of Artificial Procreation, put out by Sophia Institute at sophiainstitute.com. I suggest you get it, read it. It'll give you a lot of answers that you may be searching for. It's an accepted medical procedure. We're going to talk about what really it is. It's becoming more commonplace, but it's not approved by the Catholic Church, and that's what we want to talk about today. So, Dr. Trasancos, thank you for joining me today for Mercy Unbound.
Thank you for having me on. It's always a nice honor and pleasure to be here.
Tell us about, your training. You've got a Ph.D., your own spiritual walk, but this book was well written. And what led you to want to write this book?
Well, the short answer is President Trump being elected. I like a lot of things that he does, but he's wrong on this issue. He's got the right end in mind, but it's the wrong means to get there. And so as soon as we knew that he was elected, we expected an executive order. And so well before February 18th, when the executive order came out, Sophia Institute Press asked me to get to work writing the book. And I actually wrote it in a month, and the team at Sophia Institute got the book out within the 90-day review that the executive order called for. So that was the short-term motivation, but on a bigger scale, I've been following embryonic stem cell research for about 10 years as a scientist, and as a convert who went on to study dogmatic theology, and a writer. I've been interested in the bioethics of human embryonic stem cell research. So those stem cells, the embryos for the stem cells, come from leftover IVF embryos that are put into storage. So I knew a lot about this topic, and I was able to pull it all together and write this book. But I was also, on a personal level, happy to write a book like this, because to really understand IVF, there are, half the population is against abortion. It's a much smaller amount of the population that understands why IVF is immoral. And so I was very happy to do a full argument against it and explain, because to make this argument, you have to get into what does it mean to be human? Why does the church say human babies have rights to love? And what does it mean then to say that we're married? And what does it mean to say that we accept children as gifts? So I had to get into all of that, and I was glad to do it, because there's so much healing in this teaching outside the scope, beyond the scope of IVF. So it's really a chance to put this beautiful teaching of the church into words. And the last thing I want to say there is, I am a convert. As a chemist, I was very much a materialist who thought science had all the answers. I'm a convert from that way of life to accepting the fuller truths of the church. So it means a lot to me on a personal level to get this message out there, because it's the good news. It's a message of joy.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Bishop Burbridge of Arlington wrote a message in your book, a heartfelt message, realizing that the church understands the pain of infertility and the anguish of those who for years struggle to have a child. But years ago, didn't the church already predict that the destruction of embryos, the fragmentation of the family, and exploitation of life in the laboratory? I mean, this was like predicted 50 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, even longer than that. And I did not know this before I started researching for the book. But even back in the late 1800s, in 1897, scientists were already talking about using the procedure called artificial insemination. And that is a procedure well known and studied for livestock. It's for farming. You want to produce the best cattle, the best pigs, the best crops. And artificial insemination is when you take the sperm from the male's genes that you want and you artificially inseminate the female. You put the sperm into the female. And it came up in the 1800s in the medical community. Why can't we do this with humans? This might be a good idea for humans. And the question came to the Pope at the time. And the answer from the theologians and the Pope was a very clear not licit, not okay. No, you can't do it with humans. So I don't think a lot of people realize, even since the 1800s, the church has been saying no. And then in the 1970s, when the first test tube baby was born, the church followed up the decade after that with Donum Vitae, which specifically addresses in vitro fertilization, the gift of life. And then later, Dignitas Personae, the dignity of a person, to address IVF and all the other bioethical issues that followed from it. So I love that the church is always right there on point with the teaching here. A lot of Catholics may not know the teaching, but it's there to be learned and consumed for the sake of our happiness and our sanctity.
You wrote a pretty good section of the book, details the theology, moral issues, and you talk about the Didache. What is that? How does that begin? And you talk about the two ways. Share with us some thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, in looking for the title, thank you for asking about that. In looking for the title of a book, I was praying. I wasn't quite sure what we were going to title this book. And the Didache came to mind. Of course, it talks about abortion in the Didache, but it begins I mean, first of all, if for those that don't know, the Didache is an early Greek text it's the earliest catechism. It presents the teachings of the 12 apostles as they went out, like in the Acts of the Apostles, they went out to spread the good news to the Gentiles. And so this was the very first written manuscript, the text in Greek that was used to pass on the faith. And it begins, the very beginning of it says, there are two ways, one of life and one of death, but there is a great difference between the two ways. And it goes on to talk about the 10 commandments. The way of life is that we should love God who made us, and secondly, love our neighbor as ourself. And then it gets into, what we now call social justice. And I was really struck by that, because that was where the title came from. IVF is not the way. It's not the way of life. It's not the way of loving God and loving neighbor. And I, again, as a convert, I am so amazed when I discover that church teachings like that go all the way back to the beginning of the church.
In Humana Vitae, Pope Paul VI wrote of an inseparable connection established by God, and it discusses the unitive and procreative ways. If you could just explain that, because to me, that explains why a lot of this stuff isn't moral. But what did he mean? What was he talking about?
That is such a great question. I'm glad that you ask it, because that is the challenge. Think about it. If you understand the church's teaching about IVF and you need to go out and start evangelizing, start having conversations with people in our country, immediately, here's what you're going to, let me just do a test. You're going to go out to your neighbor and you're going to say, IVF is wrong because it separates the unitive and the procreative aspect of the conjugal act. People are going to look at us like we are we have two heads. They're going to look at us like we're speaking jargon, because we are, in a way. I mean, it is a very theological, dense statement, and people don't talk like that in normal language. They don't talk about unitive and procreative aspect of the conjugal act. And what that means is, it means that we don't separate the life giving from the love making of the sexual act within marriage. And again, even if you say it in clearer words like that, people look at you and say, "So what? Of course we can. We separate to the acts of things all the time. Legs are for walking, but legs can be used for sports. We separate, food. We can enjoy it or we can eat it for nutrition." They don't understand what you're saying there. Um, and so that gets into a deeper conversation about what does it mean to be married. So you have to understand what it means to be married to say you can't separate life giving from love making. It means to become one. That's literally what a child is. Two gametes become one new child. But in marriage, it's two whole individuals become one married couple, and they're united that way. And the church is teaching is this. It's that to bring a new human into existence, to work with God in the creation of a baby. That baby, before it even exists, its very first right is the right to be born of the love that is intimate, not just bodily, but also spiritually between the husband and wife. And then people say, well, babies are conceived all the time in less than ideal situations than that. That may be true. There are people who become pregnant out of wedlock. There are people who are, women who are raped and become pregnant. There are married couples who are not all that united, who don't really like each other, and they become pregnant. There's all kinds of ways that children can be conceived, but in all of those ways, the child's rights were violated. And so the church is saying you can't intentionally go and violate the child's right by separating the life giving part from the love making part. The child has to be born of your marital intimacy in the sexual act. And if you got any discord between you, you ought to fix that too. The church is saying that. And it is a hard thing to teach people, even other Christians, even Catholics. They think it's just not that important. That it's, if the couple loves each other, it's their business. If they want to use IVF, they can. But what the church is saying is you shouldn't.
Isn't it fair to say that techniques that assist the conjugal act, the sexual act, in producing children are okay, but those that replace that act, which is what IVF is doing, are not?
Yes, exactly. That's called, there was a theological term for that. It was the principle of replacement. You can assist. Donna Vitae said that you can assist, but not replace. And so that's a really good guideline, because if a couple is having trouble conceiving, there are lots of ways to heal some medical problem in either the man or the woman. And I know most about the woman because I am one, but there are hormones that you can take, or you can, what I really like about fertility care, from Dr. Hilgers and the Creighton model in the church, but it's NFP, but is that that method looks at the whole woman, looks at stresses in her life, looks at her hormone cycles over a series of months, looks at any other thing that might be causing her not to ovulate. And I know people who teach that method and work with people who think they're infertile, and a lot of times it's just that the woman's cycle is not 28 days, it's something shorter or longer, and so she's not fertile on the days she thought she was fertile on. She is fertile. They're just missing the day. So I love anything that assists in that way is absolutely fine, and that's what we're actually hoping, is that President Trump's administration will fund that kind of medical support and that kind of research, because not only does it help heal the woman, it maintains the integrity of the marriage. And you've got to have strong marriages if you're going to have strong families. There's no sense in trying to solve the birth rate crisis by just making a bunch of babies with IVF that aren't going to grow up in strong homes. And I'm not saying just because you use IVF, they're not, but at a societal level, promoting that encourages broken homes.
Well, let's talk just a practical. How common is IVF and what's the cost?
So it's becoming more common. There's not a lot of hard statistics on how often it's used, but you'll hear things like, 1 in 10 children you meet are going to be born by IVF. It's on the rise. It's been rising ever since the 1970s, and it is poised to keep growing a lot. I don't think anything we say is going to keep people from ultimately doing it, but we do need to be ready for it. But the cycle, and just to add to that, it's known that there's between 1 and 4 million leftover embryos from IVF in cryogenic storage in the United States alone. So that gives you some idea of how much it's being used. And my question was, why is it 1 to 4 million? Why don't they have a better estimate? And the answer I got was because we keep better genealogies of livestock than we do of human children. And they're not sure how many are in storage because they don't have the numbers for that. But a cycle of IVF is $20,000 to $30,000 right now. And a cycle is 5 steps. It's when um, the couple goes to see the doctor. The woman is going to start taking hormones to stop her ovulation. And then she takes hormones to restart her ovulation in a super ovulatory cycle where she will release more than one egg a cycle. Meanwhile, the man masturbates and produces the sperm. So, and then the woman has to go in and they remove the eggs from her. So all of that has to go on. And they get the eggs from the woman, they get the sperm from the man, and then the next step is they put them together in a petri dish in the lab. And then what the goal is, because that cycle is $20,000 to $30,000, they want a lot of eggs from the woman so they can make a lot of embryos in the petri dish. And then they have ways to select their children at this point. I just call them embryonic children. And then they have ways to select the healthiest ones that are most likely to survive. And they usually put, for cost reasons, insert more than one embryo into the woman. And then you can freeze the rest for later use, and you don't have to go through that whole cycle again. And that's what the Trump administration is looking at, how to reduce the cost of that. And I don't know how you're going to do it without making the hormones cheaper, which isn't likely to happen. The only real way to bring the cost down is to make more embryos per cycle, which is going to put more embryos in the cryogenic storage tanks. So we haven't heard yet what the 90-day review committee came up with recommendations. But we're waiting for that. I expect it'll be something along those lines.
That frozen embryo, I know in your book you stress the importance of the way, the good way and the bad way, but to me that frozen embryo problem is a serious concern because people can say, well, that's so what? That's nothing. But I asked the question, well, isn't it alive? Yes, it's
Yeah.
alive. And isn't it a human? Well, if it's not, what is it? And so you've got all these frozen children either destroyed or kept in a frozen state. I mean, that's a moral issue, I would think, that needs to be addressed.
It is, and a lot of arguments against IVF start there. IVF is wrong because it puts embryonic children in the storage tanks, and people go off arguing about the beginning of life and whether it's a human person or not. And I get to that at the end of the book. I wanted to put the argument about unitive and procreative aspect of the conjugal act in the front of the book so people would have the actual position from the church. These other things follow from that. And that what you just said, Brian, is actually the big issue in our country right now because Your listeners may have heard, or maybe not, just recently, February of 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that IVF embryos are children, embryonic children. That's where I got that phrase. And they did this because accidentally someone took some of the embryos out of one of the cryogenic storage tanks, and there's over 100 such cases in the courts right now. Electricity goes out and the storage tank thaws, or somebody takes them out and the embryos thaw. In this case, somebody took them out and their hands got cold and they dropped them. And so there were 3 couples who lost their embryos because of this accident, and they sued. They sued the clinic. And these parents are in a situation that a lot of people in the country are talking about. They're suing because they view those as their children. Oh, wait, we put our children in a freezer because we weren't ready to raise them. Now, what do you do with that? And so it's causing this dissonance in people. The court did rule that those are children. That was the only way the parents were going to be able to sue under the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, another statute in Alabama that allow the parents of a deceased child to recover punitive damages for the child's death. So they sued under that Brody Act, is what it's called, wrongful death of a minor. They sued for that. The court had to rule that the embryonic child, is a child regardless of their location. So these children aren't in the womb, right? They're in a freezer. Unborn children are children under the Act without exception based on developmental stage, physical location, or any other ancillary characteristics. However, the court also said, but you can't find the reproductive center for this. So the court also had to make some protective language for the reproductive centers who are doing this. And so it's contradictory. And it's good that that is being exposed and people are having to think about it. And one thing they argued in that court case was the parents are going to kill their children anyway. The parents already had signed things that say, if we don't use our embryos in 5 years, kill them. If we don't use our embryos in a certain amount of time, they can donate them to science for embryonic stem cell research, which is to kill them. So it's kind of a mess, and that's where we are. And if there's over 100 cases in the court now about the same kind of situation, I think more than ever, we as Catholics need to be ready to make these arguments. We need to be able to explain to people why the church teaches what she does.
Now, how many embryos are frozen or destroyed with each cycle of IVF? And parents, correct me if I'm wrong, but it may not go on the first cycles. They may have to do this more than once. So what's the average embryos that get frozen or destroyed?
I don't know the average. I don't think there is a number I don't think it's known. There is a number. I just don't think it's known for the average amount, because it depends on the couple. I've talked to couples who say, we only fertilized 1 egg. We didn't want to have to store embryos. We only fertilized 1 egg. The medical professionals are going to advise against that, because you're going to spend $20,000 or $30,000 regardless of whether you fertilize 1 egg or 10. And then the couple has to make a decision about what to do with the extras. Some of them are adopted, which is a whole other bioethical can of worms. Some of them are put you at the point of decision. You either freeze them or donate them to science, or kill them. So they probably, my guess is, just educated guess here, they probably, for the most part, every time there is a cycle of IVF, there's 4 or 5 embryos that go into a freezer, because I think most people don't want to kill them right away. They want to save them in case they want to use them. And, I say it like this not to upset anyone, but when you do that, what you're doing is saying, we don't want to raise our children yet. We're going to pick the ones we want and store the rest, like fish in the freezer, and we might thaw them out and use them later. We might let somebody else have them, or we might just kill them. And I know for a fact, because I talk to people, they don't think about that when all they're focused on is getting a baby. They don't really think about that, but they have to deal with it after the fact. And I've talked to couples whose marriage it ruined because they couldn't talk about it. They didn't know what they were going to do. And it set up this wall in their marriage that they couldn't, at least when I talked to them, hadn't yet figured out how to break down.
Again, it's such a difficult situation because you've got these parents that want children, they can't have them. For whatever reason, adoption's not brought into the picture. But isn't it like the old saying, do the ends justify the means? Isn't that really the big argument here?
It's a case of that, exactly. It's a case of the ends not justifying the mean. The end of wanting a child is a good thing, and God made us that way. And that's why Bishop Burbidge said the church understands the pain of infertility. We're made as women, some women may not at certain points in their life, but it's a very natural thing to want your own child. And we're made that way, and that's a good thing. And we're called to be open to life. But, you know, uh, but that doesn't mean you can, the church uses the language of domination. It doesn't mean you can dominate the fertility and make children any way you want to, because you're violating the child's rights. So I always want to say it that way, because nothing in this teaching says those children are any less worthy of dignity. An IVF baby is just as much worthy of dignity as any other child. That's precisely what the church is saying, that child had rights that were violated. And so, that's the kind of thing that people need to think about before they go off and try to use this method. And as speaking more to the faithful, mature Catholics out there, I mean, I consider myself a mature Catholic at this point because I converted in 2006. And I'm older. You know, I don't like to just be the older woman trying to wag a finger at younger people, but I am older, and people criticize me. I have 7 children and 7 grandchildren. How can you write a book on IVF? You don't know what it's like to be infertile. I had 2 children before I became Catholic. I've been pregnant 10 times since then. 5 of them I'm raising, 5 of them died before birth. So that's called secondary infertility. And what I've learned being in my 50s now, having raised 7 children who all have their own free will and go their own way out in the world, I cannot dress them up in plaid skirts, check all the good Catholic mommy boxes, and say, there, God, now my life is going to be easy. It doesn't work that way. Being an older, mature Catholic woman, so many things in life on a daily basis don't go the way you have planned. It's the classic, tell God your plans and he'll laugh. Things just don't go your way. What our life of faith calls us to do is to constantly be saying to God, give me the grace to do your will, constantly conforming our will to God's will. And in the case of being open to life, we have to conform our will to God's will. There are bitter gifts. You get bitter gifts all the time. There are things that happen and you don't want it and you don't like it and you don't know why it's happening. And sometimes it's not meant to happen. It does because of the free will of other people, evil things. It's how we respond that matters. And so even in infertility, how you respond to God's call to be open to life is the way to go. And God will answer that question. You will find what you're called to do. I say this in complete certainty because there have been so many things that didn't go my way. And the hardest teachings of the church I have found bring the biggest blessings. You just have to give it time to get there. There, I preached.
No, that was beautiful. You're really getting into the theology of suffering that most people don't understand. And but it is difficult. And I think the nail on the head is let's try to walk in God's will. And that's the challenge. You do mention you talked about artificial insemination early. How does that define that in relation to IVF? What's the difference there?
Well, artificial insemination, and they do this at assisted reproductive clinics, is just like I said, putting the sperm into the woman. So there are some techniques where that is done. The couple goes in, for example, and they take the sperm from the man and put it into the woman, um, to try to increase the likelihood of pregnancy. Even that is wrong because you've still separated. You've done something that replaces the sexual act in marriage. Um, the artificial procreation is the church's word. Assisted reproductive technology or in vitro fertilization takes it a step further. It gets the egg from the woman and the sperm from the man and puts them together in a petri dish, then puts the embryo in the woman. So there's a slight difference there. And then you get into other techniques where the couple can get a donor egg from another woman, and a single person can get a donor egg and a donor sperm or his or her own gamete and buy the other one, and that's what homosexual couples do. um, you just need a gamete. You need a female gamete and a male gamete. You need an egg and a sperm and put them together in the petri dish and get the embryo. And so, talking about other problems that come from not following the church's teaching in the first place, there are all kinds of stories now of people going for 23andMe genetic testing and discovering they have lots, tens, hundreds of half siblings out there they never even knew existed. And that causes identity problems for people. That upsets people to learn that about themselves. The one woman I put her story in the book. She had a health issue and she wanted to know if it was genetic. But she didn't know who her father was because she was an IVF baby. And so she went and did the 23andMe testing, and she realized that she lived in a community where there were a lot of her half siblings, and been she had dated one of her half siblings unknowingly, had sex with her half sibling, incest, and almost married her half sibling, not even knowing they were genetically related because of IVF. And this woman said, that was traumatizing. Not only does she not know her medical history, now she's traumatized to the point where anytime she sees someone that looks like her, she's wondering if she's related to that person as a half sibling. She's afraid for her own children to go out and have relationships because what if that happens to them? Like, it did traumatize her, and it affected the way that she carried out her life. Uh, so those are, I got off the trail there to your question there, but those are the different procedures. There's a whole lot of different ways this can be done. And another way that's being studied right now is the artificial womb. If there ever is a way to grow a baby to term outside the mother's body, they're going to tie that to IVF, and they won't even need the uterus in a woman to grow the baby.
Well, it reminds me of the question, just should we do it just because we can do it? And it leads us down a strange path, doesn't it?
And so many things. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
We've been discussing Dr. Trasancos' book, IVF is Not the Way, The False Promises of Artificial Insemination. Doctor, any closing thoughts here today before we wrap up the show?
Sure. Thank you for all those great questions, Brian. Hope. I ended the book with hope, because I talked to couples who had used IVF. And if your listeners are someone who has used IVF and you have a baby and you love that child, could be 12 or 13 years old now, you love that child dearly. Don't be afraid to learn this teaching. None of it is asking you to regret your child. None of it's saying you've messed up and it's irredeemable and you're just going to have to be called a bad person the rest of your life. Not like that at all. All of us sin. All of us have to go to confession. All of us, what you do when you realize I used contraception before I converted, so I did this. You have to admit that what you did was wrong, but you also have to accept forgiveness. And then you also have to turn your life toward the good. So some people have already done that. They have IVF children conceived by IVF, but their marriage is strong. They're great parents. Their children are loved and happy. That's exactly what we should do. That's exactly what you do. You turn toward the good, and all that's left is this one act. And it was one act. It doesn't mean your whole marriage was separated. It was that one act that you separated life-giving from lovemaking. Um, be sorry for it. Ask for forgiveness. Stop telling people it's the way, and then go on with your life. There is hope there. It's not, and I think a lot of people don't want to be open to this teaching because they're afraid they're going to have to admit they did something horrible to their child. Okay, you violated your child's right to be born of the most intimate kind of love. There, get over it, apologize for it, stop promoting the process so other people don't go through that, and then go on with things.
Well, Doctor, I want to thank you so much for joining me today for Mercy Unbound. Keep up the great work. People, I hope you enjoyed the show. Please share it, subscribe, and pass it on. And just remember that God's love is greater than our greatest sin. And he wants us all to come back to him who is love and mercy itself. So thank you again, Doctor. And I hope to see you back soon. Keep writing, and we'll see you back on Mercy Unbound. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/drbryan, B-R-Y-A-N, Thatcher, T-H-A-T-C-H-E-R, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again. And for more information, go to the website at drbryanthatcher.com.